Okay, so you want to know more about the French Foreign Legion in Indochina. Well, get this. Our deep dive into your sources has uncovered a connection that's, well, let's just say it's pretty unexpected.
Oh, yeah. This one's a bit of a doozy.
We're talking about former Waffen SS soldiers.
With some pretty, how should we put it, colorful pasts.
Winding up in the ranks of the Legion. I mean, how on earth did this happen?
Yeah, it's a wild story, and it really says a lot about, well, the kind of choices that get made after a big war, like World War II.
Right, because we're talking about 1945.
Right.
France is just coming out of years of Nazi occupation. They're exhausted,
Building.
trying to pick up the pieces.
And then, bam, almost immediately they're facing another conflict, the First Indochina War.
Yep, the Vietnamese are fighting for independence, and France, well, they're trying to hold on to their colony.
I can only imagine the pressure they were under, rebuilding their own nation while simultaneously trying to wage a war across the world. Manpower must have been a huge issue. Oh, absolutely. Their army was depleted, they needed soldiers, and fast. Enter the French Foreign Legion.
Ah, famous for its open door policy, right?
Right.
Pretty much anyone could join.
Well, not just anyone, but yeah, they had a reputation for taking in, shall we say, men with a past.
So this wasn't like a sudden change in policy because they were desperate. More like they were already doing it.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Since the 19th century, the Legion has been a place for guys looking to, escape legal trouble, maybe reinvent themselves, or just vanish.
So it was almost like a perfect storm, wasn't it? France in dire need of soldiers. The Legion with its history of, well, accepting those with a few skeletons in the closet.
And then you've got all these former Waffen SS members looking for a way out of Europe after the war.
I mean, we're talking veterans of some of the most notorious units, right? The Das Reich, Totenkopf.
Exactly. Some trying to avoid war crimes trials. Others, well, maybe they were just looking for a clean slate, a fresh start. Maybe some even missed the fighting. Who knows?
It just blows my mind, to think of French commanders leading units that included guys who were like literally the enemy just a few years earlier.
Yeah. It
Yeah.
really makes you question the whole good guys versus bad guys thing, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So were the French authorities aware of who these recruits were? Did they just look the other way? Or was this like a calculated risk they had to take?
Well, the historical record's a little murky on that. There are accounts that suggest French intelligence knew about the influx of former Waffen SS.
They just couldn't stop it, huh?
Well, yeah, the sheer number of them, the chaos of the post-war period, made it tough to track everyone.
So you've got these former Waffen SS trying to rebuild their lives or at least escape their past.
Right.
And then you've got France struggling to fight a war and rebuild at the same time.
It's like the perfect recipe for this bizarre historical situation. But it's important to remember we're not just talking about statistics here, are we? These were individuals, each with their own story, their own reasons for joining the Legion.
You're right. Like that story about the former SS officer who he had been involved in atrocities on the Eastern Front, and he ends up in Indochina, haunted by what he'd done, trying to escape his past in the jungles of Vietnam.
That's right, yeah. It just makes you think about the human side of all this. It wasn't just nations making decisions. It was people trying to make sense of a world that had been completely shattered by war.
For sure. It definitely adds another layer to the story, doesn't it? And it brings up some really tough questions, too.
Yeah. Like, did these former Waffen SS bring their wartime ideology and their brutality with them to the Legion? How did their presence change the dynamics of the war in Indochina? This is where we have to shift our focus a bit. We need to move from the big picture, the macro, to the individual stories, the micro, and then we can see what impact these individuals had on the conflict itself.
Okay, so we've set the stage, right? France needs soldiers. The Legion's got this history of accepting, well, let's just say, people with interesting backgrounds.
Interesting is one word for it.
And we have a wave of former Waffen SS looking for a fresh start or maybe even just drawn back into combat.
Yeah.
So what happened next? Did these guys, these former enemies, just integrate seamlessly into the French ranks? Or did their past actions cast a shadow over the war?
Well, that is exactly what we'll be uncovering next as we dig deeper into the specifics of their involvement in the First Indochina War. And trust me, this is a story you won't want to miss.
Stay tuned.
So Indochina, I mean, it was a whole different ballgame than what these guys were used to. The European battlefields, that was one thing. But we're talking dense jungles, intense heat,
Right, completely different terrain, different kind of enemy.
Exactly. The Viet Minh, they were fighting for their independence. They knew the land, and this wasn't some conventional war. You couldn't just roll in with tanks and expect to win.
So how did these veterans, I mean, they had all this experience, but in a totally different kind of war, how did they adapt? Did their skills even translate to this new environment?
Well, some did, and some, well, they didn't. Some struggled big time. I mean, all that experience in European-style warfare, it didn't really help them much in the jungles of Vietnam. But others, they thrived. These were tough guys, resourceful, used to harsh conditions.
Right, I guess that kind of makes sense. They were already hardened by war, so.
Yeah. And this is where, things get a bit darker.
You're talking about the reports of increased brutality, right? From some of the Legion units, particularly those with a lot of former Waffen SS.
Exactly. I mean, there are accounts of massacres, torture, just indiscriminate violence, stuff that, well, it goes beyond the usual horrors of war, even.
It's hard to hear, honestly. But, I mean, is it fair to blame this all on the Waffen SS? I mean, the First Indochina War was brutal for everyone, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't like the Viet Minh were, saints. There were atrocities committed on all sides.
Oh, absolutely. It would be way too simplistic to just say, oh, it was the Waffen SS, so everything bad was their fault. But the question is still there. Did these soldiers bring something with them, a certain mindset, maybe a desensitization to violence, or even, specific tactics that led to this escalation in brutality?
It's a chilling thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like the horrors of the Eastern Front somehow followed them to the jungles of Vietnam. But how do we separate the actions of individuals from the larger context? I mean, were there specific incidents, specific cases where the actions of these former Waffen SS soldiers really raised red flags?
Well, there's this one incident that always comes to mind, documented by a French journalist at the time. It involved a village suspected of harboring Viet Minh fighters, so a Legion unit led by a former SS officer. They get sent in to pacify the area. And, well, it turned into a massacre. Men, women, children just killed, no distinction. Now, like you said, this wasn't the only massacre in the war, but the brutality, the way the killings were carried out, it was just methodical. It reminded people of tactics used on the Eastern Front.
That is just awful. So was this a case of, one guy, one individual bringing his own baggage into the conflict? Or was it something bigger, like a reflection of a whole culture within certain units of the Legion?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's hard to say for sure if this was like a direct result of Waffen SS influence or just, the nature of war itself.
Yeah.
But it definitely makes you wonder about the legacy these soldiers brought with them and the potential impact it had.
It really makes you think, about how war changes people, how it breeds violence. And even if we try to analyze to understand the motivations, the actions of individuals, it's impossible to truly separate them from the environment, the chaos, the horror.
Right, and that's why this story is so complex, so difficult to really wrap your head around. It's not just military history, it's human psychology, it's the impact of trauma, and it's about the choices people make in the most desperate situations, and nations, too.
I haven't even thought about it from the Vietnamese perspective. I mean, these were foreign soldiers invading their country. What did they think? Did they even know about the backgrounds of some of these soldiers? How did that affect things?
It's tough to say for sure. The Vietnamese perspective on this hasn't been documented as much as it should. But for them, I think it's safe to say these were just foreign soldiers, invaders, no matter what their individual stories were. The differences between German and French probably didn't mean much to them.
They just wanted their freedom.
Yeah. But it's a point worth considering, right? How a conflict can be viewed so differently depending on where you stand.
It's true. And it's a reminder that history is often told from the winner's perspective, right? There's always more than one side to the story. And in this case, I think the Vietnamese perspective is essential to understanding the full impact of the war.
Absolutely. The consequences of war, they go way beyond the battlefield. They last long after the fighting is over.
This is all really making me think. We've talked about the Waffen SS soldiers, their motivations, their impact. But what about France? I mean, knowing what they did, was it even right to recruit these guys? Did they have any other options?
Yeah, that's the real ethical dilemma at the heart of all of this. And it's something we'll unpack a bit more as we look at the long-term consequences, the legacy of this whole episode.
So we've got this situation, right? France losing their grip on their colonial empire, and they make this, well, kind of a shady decision to bring in their former enemies to help fight their war. Pragmatic, sure, but ethically, well, it's pretty questionable.
Yeah. And this whole thing with the Waffen SS and the Legion, it It became a bit of a taboo subject for a long time, something that, well, France kind of tried to sweep under the rug.
They tried to pretend it never happened, huh?
Pretty much. They wanted to erase it from the whole official narrative of the First Indochina War. But you know how it is with secrets. They have a way of coming out eventually.
They always do.
Yeah.
So how did the truth finally come to light? Was it investigations,
hmm
personal accounts?
It was more of a slow burn, really. A bunch of things kind of came together to chip away at the silence. Historians, they started digging up old documents, journalists put together stories, and then some of the former legionnaires, as they got older, well, they started talking a little more openly about what they'd seen and done.
So people started putting the pieces together.
Exactly. And then there was this book published in the 80s, written by a former legionnaire who claimed he'd served alongside former SS officers. That really blew the lid off the whole thing.
Wow, I bet that caused quite a scandal.
Mhm.
So how did France react? Did they finally admit what they'd done, that they had allowed these guys into the Legion?
Officially, not really. They've always stuck to the line that it was just a handful of individuals, that they slipped through the cracks, and that France had no idea about their past. But let's be real, the evidence says otherwise. And it definitely tarnished their image, especially for those who saw it as, well, betraying what they fought for in World War II.
It's crazy how a decision made during a war out of desperation can come back to haunt you decades later. It shows you the long reach of war, how it can shape countries and individuals long after the fighting stopped.
For sure. And it brings up some big questions about how nations deal with their past, especially when it involves choices that weren't exactly black and white. Do you put national interest above everything else, even if it means compromising your values? Or do you strive for transparency and accountability, even if it means owning up to some uncomfortable truths?
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. I thought we were just going to explore a little historical quirk.
Yeah.
But it's turned into something much bigger. We've gone from World War II to the jungles of Vietnam and uncovered this hidden history that makes you really think about war, about morality, about the choices we make when things get tough.
And I think that's what's so important about exploring these stories. They challenge our assumptions, they make us question the easy answers, and hopefully they help us understand the world a little bit better.
As we wrap up here, I keep thinking about something. We've talked about the choices nations make, the things individuals do. But what about the responsibility of those who come after? Us. Do we have an obligation to dig up these hidden truths, to wrestle with the complexities of the past, even when it's uncomfortable?
That's a tough one. And I think it's a question each of us has to answer for ourselves. But for me, understanding history, even the dark parts, is crucial to building a better future. It lets us learn from the mistakes, see the patterns, and hopefully avoid repeating them.
That's a great way to put it. This has been an amazing deep dive, really thought-provoking. I know I'll be thinking about this for a long time. And to our listener, thanks for coming along on this journey with us. We hope it's made you curious and that you'll keep exploring the complexities of history. There are so many stories out there just waiting to be discovered.